in the affirmative, then you're possibly identifying yourself as someone with special interests, and then, according to our last panel, you might be exempting yourself from being electable in your given political context. Anyway, we'll see. We'll explore this question further, but. Just as Philippa Strum did in the last panel, for the benefit of people who are watching this on the webcast, I will lay out the questions that were presented to the panelists for this panel, and then I'll give brief bios of them. The questions are these. In the United States, many ethnic and religious groups have large lobbying organizations that work to influence the U.S. government on domestic and foreign policy issues. In Germany, lobbying is still in its infancy, but has also increased in the past years. Do Muslim groups influence foreign policy in Germany and the U.S.? And if so, what kind of influence do they have? So you see, this is the trick question. Does this influence take on a more formal role, such as the activities of lobbying groups, or is it rather informal? What are the differences between Germany and the U.S.? Do the German and U.S. governments seek out Muslim advice on their foreign policy? What is the relationship between Arab American and Muslim influence on foreign policy in the U.S.? And between Turkish, German, and Muslim influence on foreign policy in Germany. And we have with us three distinguished panelists. I'm going to introduce them to you from my left to my right, although we'll go in a different order of presentation. Our first panelist is Sabine Riedel, who is from the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, the Center for History and Politics? No, Wissenschaft is
Foreign Affairs.
Foreign Affairs and Policy. Okay, excuse my inadequate German. Dr. Riedel has worked at the SWP at this institute since 2001. She received her MA in Political Science and Slavic Studies and her PhD in Slavic and Islamic Studies at the University of Bonn in 1990. And she has held a number of different chairs in Paris as well as in Germany. And has many publications, and her focus has been primarily on Muslim organizations and the state in Germany and in Europe more generally. Our second panelist, the second panelist to my left, is Jane Zogby. Dr. Zogby is the author of Arab Voices, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2010, and he's the founder and president of the Arab American Institute, AAI, in Washington, which is an organization that serves as the political and policy research arm of the Arab American community. Since 1985, Dr. Zogby and AAI have led Arab American efforts to secure political empowerment in the U.S. through voter registration, education, and mobilization. AAI has moved Arab Americans into the political mainstream. And our final panelist is Dr. Samuel Raskov, who comes to us from NYU, where he is on the faculty of the law school and co-director of the Center on Law and Security. He came to the law school from the New York City Police Department, where, too bad you weren't around this weekend, you might have had some excitement. As Director of Intelligence Analysis, he created and led a team responsible for assessing the terrorist threat to the city. A graduate of Harvard, Oxford, and the Yale Law School, he previously served as a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice David Souter and to the Second Circuit Judge Pierre Laval, and is a special assistant with the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. In 2009, Professor Raskov was awarded a Carnegie Scholarship for his work on understanding official Islam. And I don't know if we have made note of this, but these Carnegie scholarships in Muslim studies have been responsible for a number of the wonderful scholars we've had with us. Abdulkader Sinow and Janan Reed also were Carnegie. Am I leaving out anybody else? I don't think so. Anyway, it's been a wonderful source of, wonderful catalyst for scholarship, and we're the beneficiaries of it. So those are our three panelists. We're going to go first, Dr. Riedel, then Dr. Raskov, and finally Dr. Zogby. So we're going to give Germany the lead off on this panel.
But before I start, I have to...
do your PowerPoint, okay.
To solve a technical
problem. Yeah, okay.
No, I will only open...
Do you need to be there to press buttons?
Switch places.
Do you want to switch places?
Sure.
Is it possible?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Just did it.
We can switch.
And I will try not to drop the papers.
Right. Excuse me. It's another... yeah.
Okay, still remain who I am.
Another presentation. Where can I start? start the
Want to get to the beginning?
Good job.
You want to get to the beginning?
yes, to the slideshow.
Okay, starts.
Here?
Yeah, that should be
Left? Beginning.
beginning.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
from the okay.
That's good.
There
Thank
go.
you.
Okay.
So, okay. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation and invitation here to come here to you and to speak about my topic today, the risk of asymmetric lobbying, Muslim influence on foreign policy in Germany. In February 2008, approximately 20,000 people had gathered in Cologne to listen to Turkish Prime Minister Recep Erdogan. Many people were waiting in vain outside to get in the Cologne arena. As the weekly magazine Der Spiegel wrote, it has been a long time, at least since the Berlin Wall came down, since 20,000 people have heard a politician speak live in Germany. In the next 10 minutes, I will present you the following aspects: the interests of main umbrella organizations in foreign policy, the asymmetry of their lobbying in Germany, and differences between Germany and the US. The aim of my presentation is to explain the potential risks of the existing asymmetry of lobbying. Up to now, the main Muslim umbrella organizations are competitors and paralyze each other, unless they change their aims, instruments or ideology, but also a shift of contextual conditions, for example by general elections, could have an effect on this asymmetry. The Muslim umbrella organizations could complement one another so that their influence could increase. Now the interests of the main umbrella organizations in foreign policy. 63% of the about 4 million Muslims in Germany are of Turkish origin. We have heard this in the morning. Therefore, it is not surprising that 3 of the 4 main umbrella organizations represent the group of Turkish-speaking Muslims. These are, first, the Turkish Islamic Union for Religious Affairs, with the abbreviation DITIB. Second, the Islamic Council, with its greatest member organization, Milli Görüş. And third, the Association of Islamic Cultural Center. Muslims coming from Arabic countries, or German Muslims, are represented by the umbrella organization Central Council of Muslims. As we can see, the belonging to a country of origin is as important as the affiliation of Muslims to a specific religious branch inside the Islam. It reflects the church-state relations in the Muslim world, where we have the dominant model of a state-control Islam. As it is well known, the authoritarian and patronizing relationship of Islamic countries to the religious consciousness of their population has provoked various oppositional movements, a part of them following the Islamist ideology. This dichotomy of the Muslim community between an official Islam and a marginalized and persecuted branches provokes a division of Muslims migrants abroad also. In Germany, we have the following situation. Whereas the DITIB is associated with the Presidency of Religious Affairs in Turkey, this is the Diyanet, the Islamic Council with its Milli Görüş, as well as the WIX, are prohibited or marginalized in Turkey because of their Islamist ideology. What has this to do with foreign policy? I argue that such a close connection between religion and policy and their relocation abroad enables the Turkish authorities to use the religious consciousness and affiliation of the Turkish-speaking population in the host countries, like Germany, as an instrument for its foreign policy. By law, it is one of the main duties of the Presidency of Religious Affairs, and I quote, to provide national unity and solidarity, also abroad, delegating attachés and religious officers to the Turkish embassy in Germany and to their 13 general consulates. How does this influence works? Let me give two examples. In his speech on February 2008, the Turkish Prime Minister often used the phrases "we Turks" and "the Germans" and stoked fears of assimilation. The hidden message to the immigrants is clear. They may live in Germany, but they are still Turks. He also called his audience Europeans of Turkish descent, which externalized the priority of Turkish foreign policy, the accession into the European Union. Finally, he asked, and I quote, "Why shouldn't we lobby to protect our interests?" The other example is an event on February this year, when the Conservative Religious Justice and Development Party invited about 1,500 leaders of Turkish descent across Europe to Istanbul. One of the invited German Turkish politicians said he was shocked about how openly the Turkish government had expressed its view that Germans of Turkish descent represent Turkish interests. While the Turkish foreign policy mainly aims the accession of the European Union using its state-controlled Islam and its diplomacy as an instrument for lobbying, the Islamic Council, with the Milli Görüş as its strongest member organization, has no clear standpoint in foreign policy. One reason is that it is prohibited in Turkey because of its Islamist ideology. So the Milli Görüş is focusing his activities towards an official recognition as religious group in Germany, which would guarantee its survival abroad. This step is a precondition to being able to participate in the education system of public schools, educating and teaching religion. Aside from this domestic affair, the recognition as a statutory cooperation has a direct impact on foreign policy because of the following reasons. Milli Görüş is actually no religious group or organization, but a socio-economic network with regional and international dimension. Founded in the 17th as a political movement in Turkey, it is still connected to the Turkish economy and to other Islamist organizations worldwide. It actively participates in a network of religious education of Islam situated in France at the European Institute for Human Sciences. This is one example only. The board of the theologians is ruled by Yusuf al-Qaradawi, a former member of the Egypt Brotherhood. He is an Islamic theologian supported and financed by the state of Qatar. I would conclude here a first important issue. Whereas Turkey and its state-controlled Islam abroad serve directly for its foreign policy, that means the EU membership, the influence of Islamist organizations on German foreign policy works indirectly. Milli Görüş is supporting the building of an international Muslim community, the so-called Ummah, which could be a sounding board for a mobilization by rich Gulf states and their conservative or fundamentalist clergy. The second part of my presentation, I would like to describe the lobbying of only these two Muslim organizations, the DITIB as well as the Milli Görüş, from a more theoretical perspective. For a deeper analysis of the obvious asymmetry in their lobbying activities and the risks for the German foreign policy, we need to clear formal criteria. I have already mentioned the addressee, the ideological framework, the political agenda, the geographical dimension, and the various instruments of lobbying. The highest conformance between DITIB and Milli Görüş exists in the addressee, the Turkish-speaking Muslims in Germany. These two organizations are in a strong competition. Concerning the ideological framework, the low conformance between Turkey's state-controlled Islam and the Islamist agenda affects a high competitiveness between both actors. The same applies to their different instruments. The diplomacy of state authorities on one hand and the NGO networking on the other affects a low conformance and a high competition. In regards to their political aims and the geographical orientation towards the Muslim world, both Muslim organizations in Germany have different as well as similar standpoints, so that their conformance and competition are in a middle position. It is evident that a single change in this asymmetric structure could have adverse effects. These two Muslim organizations could, as a result, supplement one another and intensify their lobbying. The risk for German foreign policy are apparent. Since the conservative religious justice and development is the ruling party, there is a tendency towards an official amalgamation of the Turkish nationalism and the ideology of Islamism. It supports the role of religion as an important political factor. So it's not surprising that the EU accession of Turkey would be increasingly discussed in terms of religion and religious consciousness of Europe. The differences between Germany and the US, I would underline two important aspects in this sphere. First, the US is an international global player, so that its foreign policy has more power to resist the influence of lobbyists of Muslim organizations, whereas the power of German foreign policy is limited mainly by the European political system that follows an intergovernmental approach in determining the agenda of foreign policy. The second aspect is that the lobbying of Turkish Muslim organization in Germany concerns not only the foreign policy. Half of the migrants, we have discussed it in the morning, half of the migrants of Turkish origin are already German citizens that are about 1 million, and they have the right to vote. In these terms, Turkey's lobbying interferes directly with German domestic policy. Let me emphasize the main result of this comparison between Germany and the US. The lobbying of Muslim organizations has different quality. With the accession process, Turkey already is taking part in the political system of the European Union, but it will have more influence once it becomes a full member. In conclusion, lobbying gives NGOs a voice which helps to prevent a monopoly of state interests. But the lobbying of Muslim organizations could not only be regarded as a contribution to a pluralistic society in order to avoid a monopoly of state interests, because in the case of the two organizations, the DITIB and the Milli Görüş, lobbying could be abused to create a new monopoly of interests by the Turkish state or by Islamistic ideology. My advice at the end would be: democratic societies have the duty to support those NGOs and GOs which accept the pluralistic character of our societies and also of the Muslim community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Riedel. Okay, now we're going to turn to Dr. Raskov.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to present this afternoon. I've learned a lot in the course of the day thus far, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot this afternoon as well. What I thought I would do, since we're now all aware of the fact that the questions we were asked were in fact trick questions, is employ something like a lawyerly dodge, which is one's prerogative as a law teacher, and kind of think about some of these questions, but maybe not in exactly the spirit in which they were asked. Because it occurs to me that on one level, the idea that Muslims would be active in the process of the formation of American foreign policy is entirely banal, totally unremarkable. After all, it's a characteristic of all policy formation inside the United States, including foreign policy formation, that all sorts of groups, all sorts of interest groups, some of them having an ethnic character, some of them having a national character, some of them having an economic character, some of them having a professional character, some of them having a religious character, are involved, and we accept that as a sort of as a totally unremarkable feature of our political process. So the idea that, to me, that there would be kind of Muslim organizations involved in lobbying efforts and expending money on campaigns, making the rounds on the Hill, or trying to influence officials in Foggy Bottom, well, yeah, of course, that's going to be the case, and, you know, whatever one feels about the role of lobbies and interest groups across the broad range of policy and foreign policy is, I suppose, what one feels about the role of those of Muslim groups, just like any other group. There's a second totally banal sense in which the answer to your question is an obvious yes. Part of your question, after all, is, do Muslim groups influence foreign policy? And more broadly speaking, the title of the panel we're all on is The Role of Muslims in American Foreign Policy. And to the extent that we're not talking only about American Muslims, but about Muslim groups and Muslims in general the world over, clearly Muslim groups and Muslim individuals and Muslim states and Muslim political leaders and Muslim political actors play an enormously important role in informing American foreign policy, including American foreign policy in the part of the world that some refer to as the Islamic world. With all of the sort of problematic and sort of unsettling implications of that term. But the idea that the Saudi ambassador to the United States, that Muslim political actors in Egypt, and for that matter, that the president of Iran doesn't play a key role in informing American foreign policy would be absurd. Of course they do, although not necessarily in this kind of straightforward way that I think the question is designed to get at. But I think there is something surprising about the role of Muslims, and specifically of American Muslims, in the formation of American foreign policy. And I wanted to mention kind of three things about that, and to bring the conversation kind of a little bit closer to home. The first thing I want to say is this. In a sense, what's unique, I think, may not be entirely unique, but I think what's characteristic of the relationship between Muslims and Muslim groups and foreign policy in the United States is the idea that it's not always the case that Muslims and Muslim groups are the ones clamoring to have their voices be heard by the U.S. government. So in the familiar model of political economy, interest groups try to bring their own private interest to bear on their congressmen, on their policymakers, and so on and so forth. And the government is essentially positioned as a potential consumer of all different viewpoints, and however the process works, in your sort of sense of how political process develops, is who wins the competition for government influence. But I think what's interesting about the relationship between Muslim groups and U.S. foreign policy nowadays, and when I say nowadays, I mean to suggest in the 11 months thus far since the president's address in Cairo, and in the wake of an American foreign policy that is in some way bound up with the president's Cairo agenda, is that the government is itself reaching out to, among others, American Muslims and American Muslim groups in order to secure the American foreign policy that the administration is pursuing. In other words, there's something about the America's kind of post-Cairo foreign policy that implicates American Muslims. They possess something that the administration badly wants, and if you had to put a word on it, what I would say is they possess the capacity to make legitimate the government's exercise of power overseas in the manner that the president set out in his Cairo address. So in other words, the perspective on lobbying and on influence that has it that private groups are there to pressure government agents to take decisions that more or less correspond to what the private groups would want, I think is a little bit kind of turned upside down in this model, where the government is seeking out the kind of affirmation or the kind of legitimacy, possibly to an extent also the kind of expertise that resides within the American Muslim community, but that is in any rate kind of fundamental to the pursuit of American strategic interests across the world, and especially in the part of the world where politics is informed in large measure by Islam. So that's point one. Point two is a second kind of lawyerly dodge here, because I want to bring the conversation across the barrier from foreign policy as such to kind of security issues more generally, and to implicate discussions of domestic security as well. Because one of the things that's characteristic about the relationship between the American government and American Muslims nowadays after Cairo, but frankly more generally in light of the counterterrorism agenda and what's come to be known as the counter-radicalization agenda, is that the U.S. government is kind of actively seeking out groups, not just for purposes of securing the legitimacy of our foreign policy overseas in our kind of hearts and minds campaign, if you want to put it that way, but also domestically as part of a counter-radicalization agenda that's actually taking place right here within the United States. So groups like CARE, groups like ISNA, groups like ICNA, groups like the MSAs become an important part of American security policy. John Brennan, the president's lead counterterrorism advisor, recently addressed the Muslim Student Association at NYU, and when he did so, he made a point of emphasizing some worries about the way in which the government and Muslim groups are interacting nowadays. And one of the things he observed, which is becoming something like a catchphrase, I think, within the kind of domestic security and national security crowd, is that there is the possibility that when the relationship between the American state and Muslim groups is characterized by this kind of dynamic, there's a worry about what Brennan called the securitization of the relationship between the government and Muslim citizens. In other words, there's a worry that's been quite prevalent in the United Kingdom and possibly also on the continent. I'm kind of less familiar with it there. There's a worry that somehow the U.S. will become known to Muslim citizens principally as the government that wants to be able to secure their trust, but also that wants, in a sense, to prevent them from taking kind of steps in the direction of becoming radicalized in a way that the government deems unacceptable. If you want a kind of reductio ad absurdum of this tendency, it actually comes from the British analog to American counter-radicalization policy. In the UK, they call it PREVENT. It's part of their overall counterterrorism strategy. Preventing is preventing principally young men of Pakistani heritage from essentially becoming radicalized. And one example, and this is a true example, is that if you're a bunch of kind of 16-year-old miscreant teenagers, and I'm sure many of us have experience with them or have been one of those at a certain point in his or her life, and you want to get money from the state in the UK to essentially fund your soccer league, you don't apply to the kind of fund our soccer league or else we'll end up playing video games and being a bunch of hooligans fund. You apply to a fund that essentially says, pay us this money to play soccer or else we might be in danger of becoming radicalized. So there's a sense in which kind of radicalization informs the most kind of everyday quotidian experience of citizens, of Muslim citizens in particular in the UK. And I think there is a worry here as we migrate towards this counter-radicalization approach to security issues that the same might become characteristic of the United States as well. I'll gloss over, but I'm happy to address in the Q&A portion of our panel the worry about the prevalence of surveillance and of law enforcement more generally in a disproportionate manner within Muslim communities. Let me just kind of get right to my kind of third big point, and I'll conclude on this note. My third big point is that as a way of managing the risk of terrorism, especially now that counter-radicalization is the kind of strategy of choice, it occurs to me, inside the United States. It's certainly the instrument of choice in continental Europe and in the United Kingdom. There are three main things we ought to be on the lookout for, all of them, or each of them in its way, troubling and kind of requiring further inquiry. One is the institutional commitment on the part of the United States government not to a foreign policy that's informed by Muslims. Once again, I see that as a kind of a no-brainer. Of course it is, and of course it should be. That's the American way. But a foreign policy that's informed by Islam and by what I call, in my thinking on these issues, by a certain conception of Islam that's essentially the government's conception of Islam. I call it official Islam. So official Islam now becomes a centerpiece of the government's policy domestically but also overseas. You catch a whiff of this in the fact that Secretary Clinton now has a special representative on kind of Muslim issues and on Muslim countries, or the fact that President Obama has decided to take a page right out of President Bush's playbook and to send a delegate to the to the Organization of Islamic Conference, in effect, to send an ambassador to an unabashedly kind of confessional organization, and not a state like the Holy See or the State of Israel or Saudi Arabia that aligns itself prominently with a kind of certain religious tradition. So kind of be on the lookout for the idea that official Islam is now part of our foreign policy. The second thing I would say, and kind of related to this idea that official Islam is now informing our thinking about these things, is that there's a kind of conceptual worry about this. I would kind of pitch this at the level of political theory, which is that one of the reasons why the government is interested in an official conception of Islam is so that the government can manage Islam or manage the members of the community who profess Islam as their faith. So there is a sense in which this is exactly how European security strategists and political thinkers have pursued the problem over the last generation. They've essentially tried to domesticate Islam, to nationalize it, partly by way of trying to contain it. And as the United States goes down that path, I put to you that we ought to be thinking deeply about, some of the implications of that. The third thing I want to say is to kind of come back to my lawyerly training, and specifically to the constitutional law of the First Amendment. And this might point up a kind of a difference, once again, between the United States and the continent. The United States is prohibited, which is to say the government, at any level of the government, is prohibited from establishing religion. Now, in the obvious case, what that means is the United States cannot declare, President Obama cannot declare, the Congress cannot declare tomorrow that Catholicism is the official religion of the United States. But that's only the beginning. The Supreme Court has elaborated on this prohibition over the last half century, and we're all pretty clear now that the United States can't become too entangled with any official pronouncement on religion. Now, there's an open question, and once again, I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A. It's a little bit of a kind of lawyerly point about whether this prohibition limits what the U.S. government can do overseas as well as domestically. But let's assume for the moment that we're talking only about domestic. My concern is that in pursuit of this strategy of counter-radicalization and the instantiation of a kind of official conception of Islam, the U.S. government may be coming closer and closer to the line of establishing an official conception of Islam. Problematic from the standpoint of Muslims, problematic from the standpoint of political theory, but also problematic from the standpoint of the law.
Thank you. Dr. Zombie?
Thank you. Part of me feels like, I don't know if you remember, Ross Perot's running mate in the debate, Admiral Stansfield, when asked the question, "Why are you here?" started with, "Why am I here?" I come at this quite differently than both of the panelists, the other panelists, and from most of the folks who've spoken to you so far today, in that I have a self-interest. I organize ethnically. Religion and organizing religion as a political, as one's political identity is the bane of my existence, and I'm straight out front with you about that. It has been the issue that has divided my community, whether it was the Lebanese or the Egyptians who fights over these questions and have harmed themselves here domestically to the degree to which they reflect the religious battles from quote-unquote back home. And those exile groups who have as their principal identity their religious political identity have been quite problematic for us in many, many ways, and still are. And secondly, I come to this, an extension of that, as a practitioner. I've been doing this work for 30 years full time. It's way too long. My wife says, she teases me sometimes, she says, You tried to organize the unorganizable and sell the unsaleable. She said, if you'd been in toothpaste, we'd be rich by now. But no, you had to do Arabs. It's my life's work and it's my love, and I actually don't work. I do this work. It's what I enjoy doing every single day. But it gives one a perspective based on what you see and what you do, people you've met, and the reality on the ground of how people come together. And as well as the 30 years of work I've been doing in the Arab community, I've also, for the last 15, been a founder and then national chair of what's called the Ethnic Council in the Democratic Party. Irish, Italian, Polish, all the Eastern Central European and Mediterranean communities, and have had an extraordinary opportunity to observe how they came together and organized, and the role that religion plays or does not play and ethnicity plays in shaping their political identities as well. And so, based on that, let me begin by making an observation about your discussion today. My community is fundamentally different than the communities you discuss in Europe, I believe, because we're in America. And America is fundamentally different than the European experience. There is no ethnicity that defines our national identity. I was the son of immigrants who grew up going to school. When I read Lewis and Clark on the frontier, I was actually with them. It was my story. And when Washington crossed the Delaware, I was on the boat with him. It was my story. It was told to me as my narrative, my new narrative as an American. And I believe that in that sense, we are different as a country, and therefore our communities become different as ethnic communities because we become American. Arab American, to be sure, or Irish American, to be sure. I have a heritage of which I'm proud, but I'm fundamentally an American. I'm not an exile. I was invited recently to keynote a conference in Cairo of diaspora Arabs, and I said, thank you very much, but I'm not in diaspora. I'm an American, and I'd come to you and talk about American life, if you want, or the ethnic experience in America, but I'm not going to come to you as an exile, because that's not who I am. They don't get it. Some Americans don't get it. The guys who sort of send me hate mail once in a while. But I've spoken with Pakistanis in London who tell me that after 3 generations they're still Paki. They're still Turks in Germany, or they're Arabs in France. They never become French. They never become British. It almost doesn't make sense because it's an ethnicity. And what has to happen, I believe, to end the alienation that creates the radicalization and the diasporization of those communities in Europe is the narrative has to change in those countries to become absorptive and to become transformative. See, what happens when you become American is that you become changed, but also America becomes changed as well. America is if you think about it, when you go back a century, Irish were less than human and not welcome. When John Kennedy became president, historic breakthrough, but African Americans could not vote for him. And today an African American president holds that office. And if you think about over the sweep of the century, can you imagine America without African Americans or Jewish Americans or Italian Americans? I mean, who are we? I mean, that's the point. And so we're not speaking about aliens, or when I organize ethnically, I'm not representing a country. I'm organizing as an American to shape the policy of my country to make it better, smarter, and more effective in the carrying out of its policy overseas. Not an advocate on behalf of a foreign country. People all the time, back in the old days, they'd want me to come and debate the Israeli ambassador, and I'd say, no thanks. And they'd say, but he was in America. And I said, well, that's nice, but I'm not Benjamin Netanyahu, who grew up and part of his life here in America and goes to Israel. I'm Jim Zogby, who, yes, could go to Lebanon if he wanted to, but that's not where I go. My father, may he rest in peace, would have knocked me down had I said I want to go back to Lebanon. He came here, this was his life, and this was the life he wanted me to live as an American. And so there's this difference here I think that many people just don't get. The second is this issue of identity. All of us live with complex identities. And it's not just, in the Arab world, we poll all the time and ask questions about what's the source of your identity. And people will, Arab, country of origin, some cases, depending on the country, it'll be the village or the larger extended family, et cetera. It'll be religion in some cases, et cetera. Identity is a complex phenomena. And there are some issues in some contexts that become drivers of identity. So, for example, we can have an election in America where, someone will be campaigning and focusing on the driver in this particular message as being women, going as Mrs. Clinton did, going for the women's vote, or as John McCain did for the veterans vote. In these identities we have, one will trump the others in different contexts. It's not always the same. There's sometimes I operate this way and sometimes I operate according to that identity. It depends on where I am and what I'm doing and the situation that you find me in as to how you reach me and appeal to that core that is going to be the driver. In the politics of America, ethnicity is the driver, largely. There are, for example, Catholic sensibilities. There's no Catholic vote. There's no Catholic. You poll Catholics, Catholic attitudes. Catholic attitudes largely match the rest of the country. Even on the hot button issues that the Vatican will be the most outspoken on, and this is before the scandal and the problem of credibility in the Catholic Church with its American constituency. Going back 10 years ago, Catholic attitudes on abortion, before that birth control, largely track the rest of the country. So if you go into an Irish bar and you say, my girl's getting an abortion, nobody's going to pounce on you. You say something about Ireland, you're going to be in trouble. But I dare say if you said something bad about the Pope, they might pounce on you too, because there's a Catholic sensibility, not a vote. You don't win the Irish vote in Boston by talking abortion. You don't win the Irish vote by talking about theological issues. You win that vote by talking about the questions that concern them about whether Ireland's getting a fair shake or not in visas. They want visa waiver, Ireland's economy, the Northern Ireland peace process. Those are all big concerns. And the broad range of sensibilities surrounding their sense of having been, a victim community that has taken their lumps over the last century as an ethnic/religious community that was on the outsides, and despite the fact that they're in fairly good stead today, politically speaking, no one looks at Ireland, Irish Americans as an oppressed community, there's still that sense of, it could happen, it did happen, and are you picking on me? And what are you looking at? That kind of thing. We have found in my community that ethnicity is a driver. There's a heritage question that that resonates with people. There will be sub-ethnic drivers when we talk about Palestine, Palestinian Americans, much greater intensity of feeling than some others. The Yemeni community is deeply, deeply concerned about north-south splits, and they are hammering at me every week to get meetings at the State Department to talk about human rights in South Yemen or the problem of what's going on in the north. You'll get Egyptian Americans, in the first generation concerned as well about issues, and the Lebanese community is constantly focused on what is happening in Lebanon and how America is relating to all of that. So there are the sub-ethnic drivers, But overall, one of the ways to focus the community is on the heritage issue, and this resonates in a very significant way. I did a lot of work during the last presidential campaign, going from community to community. I was a designated surrogate. I went to a Bangladeshi mosque, I went to Turkish mosques, I went to Pakistani mosques, I went to Arab mosques, I went to all over the place. And I don't ever recall getting a question at a Turkish mosque about Palestine. I don't ever remember getting a question at a Palestinian or Arab American mosque about whether or not we were going to be, in fact, whether or not President Obama would bomb Pakistan. But that issue came up all the time at Pakistani mosques. The questions resonated on the ethnic attachment question, especially with the more recent immigrants. And the third is that, do these communities have an impact on foreign policy? And the more general approach that my colleague took, I think is right, that there is this broader situation in the world that obviously has an impact. But I think the ethnic organizations here have had an impact as well on several issues. Not the big ones, to be sure, but organizing over the last 30 years, we've had an impact on issues involving Lebanon or on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. There are two factors that contribute to success or help constitute failure. One is the receptivity of the administration in question to the voices of these ethnic communities. The Clinton administration, for example, was extraordinarily responsive. And the number of meetings held at their instigation on specifically Lebanon meetings or specifically peace process meetings, it was both a question of wanting buy-in, and I think you're absolutely right, they wanted validation. They also wanted to know, as Ed Koch used to say, mayor of New York, how we doing? They wanted ideas. And when we had a problem, Israel's bombing of Lebanon in 94 or 96, they called us in, what can we do to end this? What do your folks need? They wanted to know. They understood that constituency was important, and they wanted to respond. We did not have that during the last 8 years or the 8 years of the Bush administration. There was no ethnic idea at all. They not only underplayed Arab Americans, but they dissolved the community into religious groups and created rather an outreach to Muslims, and they were only targeted Muslims, the sort of friends, because they got burned initially with the guys who they brought in that ultimately turned out to have some problems. And so they wrote off the community completely, and or sort of they cherry-picked within groups. So they liked, for example, some Egyptian Copts, or they looked for domestic vote groups that they could peel off of the larger group, but they did not seek input on issues. And when they talked about Islam, they did the kind of things you did, which was create a kind of unofficial Islam and an official approach to Islam. We're still not clear where the Obama administration is going to go with this. It's leaning to some degree in the right direction, and some degree they make some problems for us in the leaning in the wrong direction. They had a conference, an entrepreneurial summit here in Washington, a great concept, but read the literature. It was for people from Muslim majority countries and their minority populations. I mean, what the hell's that all about? I mean, in other words, 40% of Lebanon are dhimmi, like minority populations, you reduce to that, or Egypt. I mean, the language plays badly in the Middle East. It might make sense in some countries, but Muslim majority country and their minority populations is a horrific way, if you understand the region, to talk about it. And so this is an issue that we will still be talking through, is how you relate to these communities. I mean, does it make sense to deal with this as a broad Muslim world, or does it make sense to talk North Africa, Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia as separate regions that have unique concerns that affect our policy? Do we have a problem with Islam and Muslims, or do we have political problems in particular regions of the globe that require our understanding and unique handling of each? Sure, there are some reverberations beyond, but it's not possible, I think, to address them in the broader sense, rather in the more focused sense, is the more helpful way to do it. I will stop there. I think those three notes: we're not exiles, we're living in diaspora. That's a fundamental difference of who we are. When we lobby as Americans. And two, I think that the ethnicity factor is significant here and must be understood as a driver of behavior and attitude. And thirdly, how effective these communities can be is a function both of the receptivity. Oh, and the last issue is the capacity to act. You can get invited into a meeting even if they want you to, and not be able to do it. I remember years ago, George Mitchell held a meeting in the Senate, which he unfortunately never got, and talks about it all the time, of Lebanese Americans. But he didn't listen to us about who to invite, so he invited in the exile groups rather than the Lebanese American groups. And he said, it was an hour of the Lebanese civil war being fought out in front of me. Well, of course it's going to be if you invite in the representatives of each of the factions in Lebanon who happen to be in America with a little front office of the Lebanese forces or the Phalange group or the PPS, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, or the whatever. What you're going to get is they're going to carry out their mission of representing their parties back home, as they call it. But were there Lebanese American groups and Arab Americans who are of Lebanese descent who would have given a broader view of Lebanon and given him a different discussion? The answer is yes. They invited the wrong people to the meeting. And so the exile groups do function some way and don't have capacity. The broader community, I think, does. And there are some emerging voices that I think are worth paying attention to in each of the communities, whether it's the Arab community or the Pakistani community. I think in particular those two being the larger groups. But now the Turkish community is rising as well, and we have a new, on May 12th, there will be a major Turkish coalition coming together of Turkish-American organizations as Americans. They're Democrats, they're part of the Democratic Party, they work 200 volunteers a day, each weekend went from their organization to Pennsylvania to do campaigning for Barack Obama. They see themselves as part of the American political fabric, and they're the newest ethnic community on the map as far as we're concerned. So I thank you very much, and we'll take questions, I guess.
Yes, please, questions. Please wait for the mic and identify yourself. Yes, over here.
Hi, Juliette Tolai from the Transatlantic Academy at the German Marshall Fund again. I actually have too many questions. I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to put them together, or maybe I'll come back in a second round afterwards. I just want to focus a little bit on again Turkey and Germany, but I think it's going to shed light more in general about the role that countries of origin can play in the integration of migrant communities. And this is going to sound actually a little bit like I'm defending Prime Minister Erdogan, which is very weird for me, since I usually I'm very critical of his person in general. So this is kind of an interesting exercise. But just on the speech he did in Germany in 2008, one of the things is, yes, you said that assimilation was something bad and that Turkish populations, like Turkish population or population of Turkish origin in Germany, should not assimilate, but he made the point really clear that they should integrate. So he had this kind of very interesting thing. So it's not clear what he meant and what exactly, both what he meant and the way it has been interpreted among Turkish communities, what's the difference really between assimilation and integration. But I think in his mind, and it has been interpreted like this, it was actually kind of a positive thing of, we used to think of you as being Turkish and you will always be Turkish, but it's actually very important that you engage in the society you live in and really do this in a positive way. Second, he has been criticized for making this link between the Turkish communities living in Europe in general, especially in Germany, and Turkish accession. But actually, this is really a reaction to a European discourse that have been developed in the preceding decades. That, like, Turkey, I think, had not seen Turkish communities as a tools in this before, but after Turkey has been hearing that one of the reasons why we have problem with your candidacy to the European Union is because, well, we have problem with the Turkish migrants in Europe, and I think there has been this new awareness by the Turkish government that yes, there is a link here, and they have been reacting to that by basically telling Turkish migrants that, look, whatever reforms and whatever things we improve in Turkey, as long as you Turkish people in Europe don't look good, we're going to have problems with our accession. And I think it was mainly a reaction to that. And third thing, also looking from Turkish perspective, there is Turkey is a little bit obsessed with lobby politics, especially to the extent that the Armenian lobby has been really critical, both actually in the US, but also in Europe has been critical in terms of having bad consequences on Turkey's foreign relation. I think this discourse by Erdogan and the other initiatives that you have been mentioning, that they have been gathering European leaders of Turkish origin in Turkey, is part of this effort of creating a Turkish lobby and kind of playing the rules of the game that other communities have been playing and trying to do that, and which is why basically Turkey has been saying that we don't have a strong Turkish lobby and we should develop that. That's why I'm really wondering to what extent they really have an impact on German politics, and I don't know if you would know, because I've heard really contradictory evidence regarding what Turkish populations generally think about Turkish accession, and do they really make the link? Because I've actually heard that the communities are really divided, and some Turkish population are actually against or not particularly in favor of Turkish accession to the EU. So I was wondering if there is a link here. And kind of a related question, but a little bit in a different area. I was wondering what Muslim but non-Turkish migrant population in Germany think about Turkey's accession to the EU, because in the Middle East there has been this idea of we're going to observe the way the EU is going to behave towards Turkey to see if the EU is really this Christian club that some people have said, or really more community of value, and it's kind of a test case towards how the EU is going to behave towards the Muslim world. And I was wondering if, in that sense, the non-Turkish Muslim population in Europe would be supportive on Turkish accession or not. And I'll stop here for now.
Several questions there
Yes.
for you.
For me, yes, but I don't want to answer the question if Turkey should be the member of EU. It's not my position here to give you an answer. I can explain you this accession process does not depend on the meaning of people only. There are criteria economically and politically. There are hard criteria for Turkey to solve this future, or this development in the future. So
I think what she was asking is what do German
my
Turks
issue
think?
my issue is you here in this conference, the role of religion. This was the main focus, and I have explained you the close connection between religious and politics in Turkey, and this is a crucial point in my perception, because this instrument is not accused not to a democratic rule like we have in Europe. In Europe, we have a division from religion and state, and this is a very important fact. We have different models, of course, of state-church relations. Every country has another system in Europe, but the tendency is clear. We want to have a separation between church and state. But in Turkey, this system of laicism is a laicism system. The state control of Islam is a problem, and it's an influence over people who are affiliated to a religion, and politics can influence on these religious group, and this is, in my eyes, a crucial point. I want to explain you this situation, and the Turkish government in this situation is using this instrument also. They have, I have explained you, they have attaches as staff of the diplomacy in the embassies and in the consultaries, and these people, these attaches, they are working in the field of religious affairs. So, and there is no separation between state and religion.
Could I just, I think what she was asking was, what is the opinion of German Turks about accession? So that would sort of complement your, I mean, what you're talking about, if I understand you correctly, is the people who are in the Turkish consulates and the Turkish embassies. In other words, they're emissaries of the Turkish state. Whereas what I think she was asking is, what do German Turks think about accession, and also
And non-Turks.
and also what do non-Turkish Muslims think about accession? I don't know if you have studied that, but do you have any insights into that, into those questions? In other words, it's not just the Turkish state, but Turks and Muslims on the ground.
I
in
have no
Germany.
valid sources to say what they are thinking. I can't say it. I suppose that the most of them, they are looking forward to an EU membership of Turkey. It's clear. Why not? It's clear. But in this discussion about the EU membership, we don't forget the criteria. The criteria for a membership. It's not possible that every country would be a member. There are hard criteria for democracy and for economic stability. And you see in this situation now in Europe how important these criteria are. For example, the Greek is now in the Eurozone, but everybody know it today. They have not fulfilled the criteria. It was a decision, a political decision, and now we have these problems in the Eurozone, because the criteria are valid, but they are not. They were not the important reason to join into the Eurozone. So it is a parallel only to explain the situation now with Turkey. Turkey is a country in development. There are progresses, of course, in direction of democracy, the rule of law. This is a very good way, but it's not enough. It's not enough, and we have to take this under consideration. And of course, it is important what are people thinking. You are right, but this is not the crucial criteria to decide this topic.
Do you have any information about this? Yeah, Andreas. Excuse me, Abdulkader.
I
Yeah,
don't have exact numbers, but I know that the Center for Turkish Studies is asking that this question on the Turkish population repeatedly. And what I recall is that among the naturalized citizens, and very similar to what we experience in the United States, is once you made it in the country of immigration, you are quite reluctant and critical of further immigration from the country where you come from. It's not always that you support immigration, and that's also, it's not automatically that you support accession of Turkey to the European Union. And even though I don't have exact numbers here, I can tell you, at least from my analysis on voting, we have open questions on issues and problems. And this was an issue that did not really pop up as being important among those naturalized Turkish citizens. And I think the non-Turkish Muslim population, I don't know whether there are any numbers on Turkish accession. So I don't think so.
Okay, Abdulkader, and then.
Now, there's a sense of, the sense of alarm in your talk, Sabine, about the potential for those groups to be activated to assist Turkey. Now, first, it shouldn't be surprising, right? And when majority of them don't have German citizenship, of course, they'll be more amenable to collaborate with their country of origin. That's one link that's valuable to them. So first, there's no element of surprise. And second is, so what? For them to lobby, not only should they exist and should be motivated, but they need to have means to influence German institutions. And as we've heard often here, Muslims in Germany and pretty much elsewhere in the West have very few leverage, very little leverage over state institutions to influence foreign policy, let alone domestic policy or protecting their civil rights or religious rights, or or other what they perceive to be to deal with other transgressions on their rights, what they perceive to be transgressions on their rights. And I'm really not an expert on Germany, but pretty much across the West, in the countries I know quite a bit about, Muslim populations are some of the most helpless, potentially mobilizable groups when it comes to influencing their country's foreign policy in the Middle East or elsewhere. I can give you examples from even members of parliament in the UK. One of them told me, from a Conservative Party, he told me off the record, if I express my opinion on the Arab-Israeli conflict, my career will be over tomorrow. So even people who are inside the institutions have so many restrictions on what they can do. And so it's a far call from, even if they mobilize, even if they want to help Turkey, that they will have an impact. Thank you.
But I want to add something to your questions I have heard. You are speaking about the Turkeys in Germany, and we have discussed the possibilities and the possible political instruments for integration. So what is the aim really? To integrate these immigrants as German citizens with a German citizenship. So it must be the way to the immigrants to have a consciousness of a Germanness, like your Muslims in the United States. It's not true that, as you have said, that Europe has only the model of a nation state with is connected with ethnicity. We have, after the Second World War, different developments in the direction that there is a difference between a cultural nation state and a political nation state. And also in Germany, we have discussed it in the morning, with this change of the citizenship, of the law for the citizenship, the legislation, we have now the chance to be, in a real sense, a political nation with a lot of immigrants. But that means for the immigrants that they have the possibilities to also to develop a German consciousness, like your Muslims and or your ethnic groups in the United States. Is the same. And another good example is France, of course. France is a model of a political nation, and everybody know it. The President Sarkozy, he is from Hungarian origin, but now nobody is discussing this. It's no problem. He is integrated in the French society, so it was possible for him to be a candidate for the presidents. And so this is the way also for Germany to welcome the immigrants, that they can adopt and develop the German, and they get the German citizenship, and to develop also consciousness to be a German citizen. But when we now are speaking about the Turks in Germany, you want to support the Turkish to be Turks, and not to avoid this development. And I think this development in society is very important for our country.
Let's let Dr. Zogby reply, and then we'll...
The truly integrated model allows you to do both. To become American and yet retain that unique heritage, and the becoming American itself includes that unique heritage, so that it becomes part of the concept of being American. Silly story, when we were first married, my my wife had some of my cousins over and called her mom to say she was making, and she named a number of Arabic foods that she was making that night, and her mother said, "But why don't you make some of the American dishes I taught you?" And she listed spaghetti and meatballs and some Spanish dish, etc. The fact is that there is no American food that is not somehow derivative. Even our music and our art, all of our cultural manifestations are a reflection of that. So the idea of becoming French, as the President of the Republic says, is a particular idealized concept that does not include these other groups. That is the reason why there remains a degree of alienation despite the possibility of becoming a citizen. You become a citizen, but the country does not include you and your culture in any broader way. I think it's important that we investigate how to deal with this. It will remain a problem. One of the problems I have with our Department of Homeland Security is they go to London to say, what can we learn from... And the last place we want to go is to Europe to learn how to deal with immigrant communities. They need to be coming here. And the fact is that we have, and I sound like a chauvinist. The fact is, however, we have a model that has worked and is really quite significant. And on that, I want to just talk for a moment about the civil liberties issues, because after 9/11, we faced some serious problems. But I maintain that we are not a defenseless, despised, rejected minority. Within 3 days after 9/11, we were sitting down with an interagency meeting at the Department of Justice to work out mechanisms to address civil liberties problems and to address hate crimes. 3 individuals who threatened my life after 9/11 and continuing till just 2 years ago are now in jail for their death threats. The Department of Justice and the FBI have put in prison over 200 people guilty of hate crimes against our communities. And there is this danger that Brennan raised, but the danger is lessened by their awareness of that danger and the fact that they have taken so many other efforts to do outreach. They made one huge mistake after the December bombing with the initiation of this 14-country screening process. We had meetings with the Secretary, we had meetings of Homeland Security, meetings with the Department of Justice, the Attorney General. That program has ended and is being replaced by a new program, and we are in meetings with them to talk about how that gets implemented. It doesn't just affect us, however, it affects our relations with, it's a foreign policy question as well.
Could I just press you for a second? I mean, what does it mean then? I mean, what do you, when you say that, I mean, you're sort of saying America's a melting pot. I mean, what does it mean to you to be an American of Lebanese descent? I mean, what is that, what is the content of that identity? What, is it just eating certain foods, or what, I mean, what is it?
Look, it means that the history of this country is my history. It means that the values, standing in the National Archives building when with the President of the United States back during the Clinton era and looking at the pictures on the wall, going around and seeing a whole bunch of white guys and thinking, as the President reflected as well, they couldn't have imagined that I'd be here. That I, whose father was an illegal immigrant from Lebanon, one generation later, is sitting in the Oval Office with the President of the United States talking about foreign policy in the Middle East. That's what being an American means. It means that he and I, who come from wildly different backgrounds, share a set of values and a set of ideas, and we can interact, and that I can aspire to influence him and share my ideas with him about a critical issue involving a part of the world that I intimately know because of my heritage and my background.
So it's because of your knowledge, not because of your blood.
It's an inclination. Oh, there's no blood issue. I mean, you know, in this.
I mean, does every Lebanese have every Lebanese American have intimate knowledge of Lebanese foreign affairs?
And actually, that's an interesting question, because it's not a racial question and it's also not a knowledge question. It's an ancestry question, and it's a heritage. It's a kind of an inclination and a feeling. I mean, we'll meet somebody like a Charles Bustani from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and he'll talk about his grandma and his grandpa and his dad and his feelings about Lebanon and wanting to go. I mean, there's a kind of I can't describe it as much as I can say it's a sensibility, as I talked about that word before. It's a sense of a feeling about a community that you can be part of in a unique way. You kind of let your hair down. It's a family issue. And I know that the Irish feel that, the Italians feel that, the Polish feel that, and we do too. And America lets you feel comfortable about that while making it clear that your individual story is actually our American story. Our American story is actually all of our stories combined.
Over here, Richard. Yeah.
I'll wait. I've kind of lost the...
Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay, good. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. My name is Abubakar Shingiti. I'm from Sudan, and I'm the president of the American Muslims for Constructive Engagement, a group of an umbrella group for Muslim organizations that seeks to engage constructively with the administration. Started after September 11th. And had done a lot in terms of bringing Muslim organizations into dialogue with the Bush administration and now with the Obama administration. My question is for Samuel. I'm sorry I didn't get your last name.
Raskov.
And I completely agree with you on the concern that you expressed over securitization of the relationship between the American government and the American Muslim community. The concern is there. However, particularly now with the Obama administration, the degree of openness and the engagement and the attitude. Just last week, I listened to both missionaries, Rashad, Hussein, and Farah, speaking about their engagement with American Muslim communities and their travels abroad and their connection with grassroots in case of Farah. And the sense I get is that their attitude is not so much to kind of like formulate some sort of Islam that they will be comfortable with and deal with. But there are deep concerns regarding radicalization. And so the counter-radicalization policy is something genuine, and it is shared also by these Muslim organizations. The extremist tendencies, even within the Muslim community itself, is creating big problems. I'm part of one of the more open communities here in Northern Virginia, and still I could sense that, particularly in the eyes of the youth who feel alienated and who feel subjected to this securitized relationship. And as Americans, I mean, my son, I mean, after that incident in Fort Hood, his name is Hassan. So I had a long walk with him the day after the thing to kind of, because he works in Maryland, he came to me 2 days later, and some of his co-workers, okay, Hassan, now how do you feel about? So the younger generation are more angry as a result of this new environment and securitization of the relationship. So it is in our interest, those who lead these organizations, to work with the government and do something about radicalization among our own communities. And the groups that I work with, like this group, AMCE and IIIT and others, we are working on training our imams. We are working on with the defense establishment. We are working with these new entities within this counter-radicalization policy. I don't see the jump which you made from a counter-radicalization policy to official Islam. Although I understand the dynamic, and it has happened since the early days of the Muslim history, the attempt of appropriation of religion to the service of the state is ancient. But I don't see it now in the attitude or the practices of the Obama administration. So if you can elaborate a little bit on how you came to that.
Okay, it's an excellent and very kind of well thought out question, really provocation, in the best sense. Here's what I would say, kind of responsive to the question, where is this kind of worry about the instantiation of a very specific government-sanctioned account of Islam in the politics of counter-radicalization? Well, I would say the first thing I would say is the Obama administration has been exceedingly careful about it. Indeed, the New York Times, when they kind of did their story on Rashad maybe a couple of weeks ago, pointed out that a lot of this outreach is going on in a sort of quiet, backroom sort of way. And I think that is characteristic of how the administration is approaching the issue. So to say that they're not doing so in a sort of flagrant way where the president declares, here's the boundary of kind of moderate Islam, and you're either within the boundary or you're without. Certainly I wouldn't expect this president or kind of members of administration to talk that way. Nevertheless, I see in counter-radicalization, precisely because, as James said, in some sense, counter-radicalization is really just a European import. And by the way, the reason why we're doing it, I think, this is a bit of a sidebar, but I think the reason why we're doing European import on this is because the opposite was counterterrorism a la the Bush administration's kind of militarized approach, and that became discredited and politically unviable for this administration. So the European model presented itself to us as something softer, something more kind of thought through, but nevertheless something that I think is deeply problematic, both on legal terms and maybe also kind of for the reasons that you pointed out. Anyway, getting back to your point about counter-radicalization, where I see it very much is in the sort of counterterrorism strategy overseas. Sometimes it goes by the name counterinsurgency over there. But I see the same thing going on here when the FBI essentially goes out to do its proactive intelligence gathering, as it now does, pursuant to new authorities that it received in the very end of the Bush administration, but still possesses. It implicitly has some sort of understanding. When I say it, I mean the agency somehow in its DNA has a kind of understanding, and maybe it's thought out, maybe it's not, about what are the boundaries between the sort of permissible expressions of Islam and what begins to look like a manifestation of radical Islam that might ultimately culminate in a kind of the perpetration of something violent. So there must be some kind of implicit account that's informing intelligence strategy, that's informing an intervention. Take the case of Major Hassan. You see the way the politics are playing out now and the way that the government, the executive branch, is called to task for the fact that they didn't intervene earlier. But how would they know when to intervene? And what were the signatures that should have triggered an intervention? These are very, very delicate and difficult questions. And I think part of what makes them delicate and part of what makes them difficult is the fact that they are, in some sense, informed by the boundaries of official Islam. So I agree with you that the administration has been very deft and careful at managing the issue and been very self-aware of the politics of the issue and some of the, I would say, constitutional and theoretical worries that surround the issue. But I don't think that exonerates them from the charge. It's not really a charge, but from the claim that I've made that in some sense they're practicing it, as they must be, as they ought to be. Just as you said, I mean, counter-radicalization is an important strategy. I'm a kind of believer that there is some good to be reaped from doing it, but I think that there's a tendency to think of it as the new and improved version of counterterrorism without thinking through some of these kind of complicated policy questions at the boundary.
Can I just say, one of the problems I have with the counter-radicalization approach is the assumption that there is a radicalization process underway. And I testified before the Homeland Security Subcommittee in Congress, And one of the Republicans held up a map of the United States with little dots all over it, you know, Miami and Lackawanna and Texas and this one. And he said, there's this wave of radicalization and this homegrown terrorism. That's what the map was entitled. And the you know, the mistake they made with the Christmas bomber was they didn't connect the dots. This was the other mistake. It was imagining that there were dots to connect that did not connect at all, because each one of these dots were totally unique circumstances that needed to be understood in and of themselves. Major Hassan went postal, and that happens a lot. I'm not afraid of my postman when he walks up the stairs, because I know most postmen are really angry at their conditions of labor. Being angry does not constitute a threat. Speaking in harsh terms about the treatment, the way the federal government, you know, behaves with its employees does not constitute a threat. We need to, and we know how to distinguish that. Getting pissed off on, pardon my French, on whatever it was, on tax day does not mean I'm going to take a plane and fly it into the IRS building. You know, being angry about the war in Iraq does not make me a threat to national security of the United States of America. And so what I don't want to do is somehow create the sense that there is a need for this kind of insertion of our federal authority into our, basically our political discourse that Arabs and other Muslims are having with themselves about some of our policies. And I think that there's a problem with that. We need to segregate these issues, find out the causes behind them, and address each of them as unique circumstances. I think they can be grouped into bundles, but you know, a significant number of them don't have any relation to radicalization as such. A few of them do, and those are the problematic ones. I think that the Minnesota one, for example, the Somali situation, not a threat to the United States of America, a threat to the parents of these young people who lost their children to someone who exploited them basically to go on an adventure to save their homeland from Ethiopia. If we understood them all and didn't sort of conflate them all into one bundle, I think we'd be a lot better off, and we wouldn't be looking for counter-radicalization as much as we'd look for deeper understanding of the complexity of the communities and of what is prompting responses of different types.
Well, just before I call on a couple, for Samuel, especially for you, but maybe James, you have something too. I mean, what role can civil society organizations play in helping to make these distinctions?
Well, they can make the world of difference. And, you know, I share some of James's skepticism about the enterprise of official counter-radicalization. I kind of wonder about its efficacy. I wonder about its theoretical underpinnings. And as you've heard already, I kind of wonder about some of the legal issues that it throws up as well. But I think a clear answer and a clear improvement upon the model that basically arrogates to the FBI or to some other government entity the prerogative to go ahead and solve the problem of radicalization is a model that essentially leverages the expertise, the know-how, the intimacy with the issues that's possessed by the community. Now, I will give this much to kind of government actors and to the Obama administration. I think there's increasingly an awareness on the part of federal agencies. Certainly there has been this awareness for a long time on the part of local agencies like local police departments that the key to solving any of these problems, such as they are, must implicate members of the community, that they possess what I would call intelligence, but what everyone else would just call the kind of the relevant know-how and the sort of on-the-ground knowledge, not to mention the modalities, the levers to go ahead and to make the difference in people's lives. So consider me a full-throated kind of believer in the idea that the communities ultimately, possibly with some amount of collaboration with the government, and there James and I may part ways, that they're ultimately going to possess the key to solving the issue, such as it is, of radicalization.
Yeah, down here. Please identify yourself again.
Okay. My name is Gregory Gums, Catholic University. I must say I'm somewhat disappointed with this discussion up to this point in time, and there's different reasons for that. I think one of the big problems that the first discussion by Ms. Riedel concerning the dangers of radicalized minority Muslims getting influence on German foreign policy, and the demand that they just have to be German, they have to become German. It seems to me that this is a debate that needs to be placed in a larger, more fundamental context, and the context basically could be found in the United States of America. The context of, if you go back and you study ethnic minority foreign policy influence of U.S. foreign policy, it starts out with George Washington, who demanded from, at that time, German Americans, Irish Americans, what he called primary loyalty, which meant that if you were loyal to the United States, Zogby just pointed it out, you had a certain liberty to do certain things. The problem always that minority groups ask is that, okay, under what conditions can this then secondary loyalty be operationalized? Under what set of conditionalities? When is that secondary loyalty going to conflict with the so-called primary loyalty? This is a hugely complex issue that is not being touched on. And I think it goes back directly to the first issue in this thing. You are calling on people to be German. You have never defined what German is. You can't define what German is because of the 80 million German people, 20 or 30 million have a different definition from what Germany is. There's no such thing as Germany. Germany is an invented model, but it's a dangerously invented model to limit the participation. In the United States, the same thing. You have to be loyal to the American state. I'm a French Dutch descent. You have to be loyal to the Netherlands. Okay, well, just explain me now how to be loyal to the France or Netherlands. These are complex issues that cannot be, at best they can be incidentally, from period to period, from time to time, be defined in very, very problematical fashions, but never, never exact. And I think one of the great issues that we're dealing with here, again, is one of the issues of the earlier thing. The problem of integration of these ethnic minority groups. The problem that Europe faces, where I've lived quite some time in my life, that for a long, long time, even when I went to Europe as a young kid, basically Holland was 96 or 97% white. It's only really over the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years now that you have in all of these European communities, you have 10% of the population being minority. A population that is now second generation starts to get restless. They want to have influence. They want to have political input. They want to have input towards their countries. And all of a sudden now we're hearing, well, you have to be French, you have to be English, you have to be German, you have to be this, you have to be that. Okay? And what we see is another problem.
I think you haven't understood me. I have explained that it is important to give the possibilities to immigrants to join the German citizenship. Yes, this is my point. That means they are a part of the political nation of our country with all the rights of all other members of this society. This is a very important development to have these political rights with the citizenship. On the other
yes,
side,
but
excuse me, but on the other hand, the ethnicity to develop also the ethnicity of the heritage country of heritage, it is not forbidden. Why? This is not the problem. It's no problem because they have heard it in the morning. We have schools where the immigrants can learn their mother tongue. Yes, and there is also a legislation in the whole European Union. All member states have agreed to introduce anti-discrimination legislation in the sense that everybody has the right to defend and to live their mother tongue or their ethnicity. This is no problem. This is not the problem. The problem is that there has to be a development towards the citizenship, to have all the political rights for all these immigrants. And this means we have to have a strategy how to convince the immigrants to join our community.
And why not a
really important.
and why not a strategy on the part of the Germans to leave them become part of it? I mean, this is but okay. I want to ask.
Wait. Let's let some other people have the floor. I want Janan to come in on this.
Make a point.
Yeah.
But just Zachary, I want to ask you a point.
I want to make
Yeah.
a point about your one of your concerns
Right.
about here. We have not talked about this, but one of the problems I fear that is happening in our country today is the problem of dual citizenship. I mean, I hear myself talking today, and I sound like I'm some kind of, like I'm from the right of the right, but I'm actually from the left of the left. But I am deeply troubled when my government funds setting up polling places around the country for Iraqi American citizens to vote in elections in Iraq and allows them to run for office in Iraq, or when a former Bush administration official who served as a public diplomacy person runs in Lebanon for parliament, or when the Lebanese government announces that they're going to hold elections, the next election in Lebanon, they will have polling places in America. And it's true for almost 100 other countries in the world where citizens from those countries who are dual nationals in the United States can vote in the United States in those elections. I believe in absentee ballots, and American citizens living abroad can vote in American elections, but you don't get to do both. Because I think what it does is it aborts the process of becoming American and the process of developing this identity, and brings us almost too far down the road in a dangerous direction that does trouble me. I don't think you can follow and identify with the issues of concern here and follow and identify with the issues of concern there and maintain ultimate loyalty to one. I think it becomes conflictive, and it worries me that it bodes ill for national integration and the prospects for it in the future.
The only thing I would add to that is to say that, setting aside the view of kind of that James just expressed about dual nationality, I don't have an opinion about that, but I would say that it's not simply a matter of kind of legal formality. The idea that you can somehow kind of focus one's kind of national commitments in a kind of specific direction and to sort of ward off the tendency to want to at least kind of express one's ethnicity and maybe one's kind of religious viewpoint some other way, I think is sort of up against a fairly formidable technological challenge. I mean, one of the things that's characteristic of young Pakistani kids in New York City is that they can Skype back to Pakistan, or they can get on the internet and kind of read Pakistani press, or that relatively cheaply and relatively quickly they can find themselves in Karachi, something that would have been unimaginable for our grandparents, our great-grandparents who emigrated here from Ireland, Italy, wherever. So, I mean, I think that's, regardless of one's view about what passport one carries or where one votes, the fact that these identities aren't somehow kind of fundamentally different nowadays for a 17-year-old than they might have been for, someone a generation ago, or that's just not the case.
And I think that that's an important observation, that technology does change. I mean, when my dad came, it took him 2 months on a boat, and mail took 2 months on a boat, if it got here at all. And the idea of going back simply didn't exist. And now people actually go, quote unquote, home for weekends. What I'm sensing, and I think we need to study this over time, is whether or not the power of the absorptive character of America and what we call globalization in other contexts is more potent than the pulling apart of these technological issues. In other words, I'm in a cab in New York with an Egyptian driver, and he's got a 7-year-old son, and in the cab with him that day, and he's saying to him, listen, this man, he's the one who defends us. He's the one who supports our rights. He's the one. He is a great man. You should listen to him. And I'm saying, that's really nice. Thank you very much. Okay, you can stop here. And his son is saying, we're approaching Times Square because I'm doing a taping at Reuters studio at Times Square. And the kid's saying, look, Dad, can we go see that movie? Oh, Dad, wow, I didn't know that. Can I go see that movie? And then they were setting up a stage there was some rock performance. Dad, there's a stage. There's going to be stars here. Can we come? And I thought, this is the story. This is the immigrant story, and this is the child of the immigrant story. He'll be proud of Dad at some point. Right now, he's not. He's interested in the stars in the new movies. But there is this tension at play all the time. He's an American. I mean, if kids in Riyadh are wearing baseball hats and jerseys, basketball jerseys, kids here are influenced as much. And so I think that there's this delicate interplay that's going on. My fear about dual citizenship and voting in particular is that it is another factor that intrudes itself into that process and actually, I think, impedes the absorption and makes it more difficult.
Jeanette.
Yeah, so I got my train of thought back because it's been a thread that I've been hearing throughout the day. And it's a general issue I want to bring up about the question of the politics of identity. And there seems to be a disjuncture between individuals and how the state deals with it. So, John, Jim, you were just talking about, how ethnicity trumps. So the reality is people have multiple identities. In the American model, we're able to balance those identities in various ways that you cannot do in other places. And so part of what I'm hearing with the German case is, yes, but this identity, we want to define the identity that you're going to have. And in the U.S., American case, it's more like, well, I half jokingly, Jim said in the earlier panel, 5 or 6 years ago, I was an expert on Arabs. Now I'm an expert on Muslims, in part because that's the identity that's been privileged in terms of the group. So one of the general questions I have is how beneficial is it for us to sort of assume that a certain identity is what is dictating what people are doing? It's the same thing with the answer to the counter-radicalism. The assumption is there's radicalism there to counter because the assumption is, well, they're Muslim, therefore they are, insert whatever. So I keep coming back to this idea that until we figure out how to allow people to balance their multiple, you're a Lebanese, but you're American first, Yeah.
During the campaign, the Obama campaign had an Arab American outreach effort and no Muslim effort. Now they're in the White House and it's a Muslim outreach effort and no Arab American. And it's weird. It's actually weird. I chair the Ethnic Council, and all of the groups that I represent go through one porthole in the White House. Arab Americans go through the faith-based porthole. What? I mean, I can't get Maronites, Copts, Assyrians, and the Dearborn Shia community in the same room on most issues if I base it on religion. If I'm talking about the future of Lebanon, I can do it. If I'm talking about Middle East peace process, I can do it. So I think you're right that if you talk about official religion, it's the official, almost the creation of an identity, and we will deal with you through this rubric. And we won't deal with you through the other rubrics, the ones that you have historically used to identify yourself. It's the same mistake that George Mitchell made, which is identifying, here's the group I'm going to talk to and how I'm going to talk to them, and you end up with the war. And so to the degree to which we are now all of a sudden people who descend from Muslim majority countries and their minority populations, that's me, then I have to relate to that. And that's not who I am or how I identify. Do I have a religious identity? Sure I do. Are there Muslim American organizations that deal with civil liberties issues and a whole range of other issues? Of course they are. But when you're dealing with the politics and the issues we're talking about, lobbying on foreign policy issues, then what you're talking about are issues that affect us ethnically and affect us differently ethnically depending upon who we are. So I think that, however, reducing everything to the Muslim rubric would be as mistaken as saying we're only going to talk to Arabs when we talk about the problems we're facing in wherever or the problems of civil liberties. No, because the African American Muslims and the Pakistani Muslims have civil liberties problems. Hate crime problems are Sikh, not Arab or Muslim. We have to have them in the room. So as complex our identities are, the government has to relate to us in the same complex way so that they're talking to us in the context in which we're ready to be talking. And yet I think that they've forced now this Muslim issue and done disservice to Islam, elevating a particular kind of constituency within the Muslim community to the interlocutor level, and downplayed a whole lot of other folks who could make a contribution to this conversation who have no place at the table right now and are sort of so confused about it.
Can I quickly just follow
Yeah, sure.
I asked this question in the prior panel, like just the title of what we're doing here today, Muslim integration, and I said, how do you measure that? Is it measured by are there Muslims in the U.S. and are they voting? Are they holding office? Or is it that, are there Muslims in the U.S. who are voting, holding office, and working for other Muslims? In other words, I think it's a question that can't be answered because Muslims may not be politically active because they're Muslims. They may be politically active because they're professionals. They may be politically active because they're women. So it's sort of like, how do you measure that?
You talk to Arab American doctors about the health care plan, they wanted to talk as doctors. And so that was their identity in that context. And it does play. I got invited by President Clinton to speak at a forum at NYU on this issue of integration after 9/11. And so before I went up, I thought I'd survey a whole lot of people and talk to them on the phone. We had our polling that we've done, but I thought I'd just get some anecdotes. So I called about 5 people I knew who headed different groups. And one of them is a marvelous group out in the Midwest that goes by the name of the Family Picnic. These are folks who've been here 100 years, the Cedar Rapids crowd, the Columbus crowd, the Toledo crowd, the most assimilated, integrated, but deeply religious community you can find. And I got different people on the phone. One guy I didn't get. He called me on the train on the way up, and I missed the call because I was in a dead zone. But when I got the message, it was, "Hey, Jim, it's..." He said, "I got your message. I hear you want to know what I'm doing right now. My wife and I moved to Las Vegas, retired, and we're having a really great time out here. Come and visit us sometime." I hate Las Vegas. I thought to myself, what do Muslim Americans do in the third generation? They retire and move to Las Vegas. I mean, the fact is that this notion that there's an exceptional non-absorptive, that came up after 9/11, Muslim Americans wouldn't go the way of the other Arab Americans because we're Christian and they're not and they're different. Not at all. I mean, you go to these events that this group has that's 100 years old here, out in the Midwest, their summer picnic that they all get together, and you have boys and girls playing soccer together, which is different than 10 years ago when they used to be playing softball together. Now they're playing soccer. And they are, the only thing that happens is that they stop and they pray at the appointed time because they're Muslim. But they're American, and they've assimilated in so many ways that they're indistinguishable from everybody else, red hair, freckles, and whatever. These aren't converts, incidentally. These are folks who are descendant mostly from Lebanese ancestry, but have been here for, they're now into their third and in some cases fourth generation. So I think that this process, if it continues, and I believe it will continue, will create this kind of transformation unless we disrupt the transformation and artificially impede its change and, in fact, politicize their faith in a way that I think would impede the process of their becoming American in the way that every other ethnic group has become American.
I want to add something.
Could I just say something first? Because I wanted to pick up on the question before and ask you. I mean, I think that from what Dr. Zogby's been saying and other people, the thing about American identity is very fluid, and it certainly has changed. And it's not true that it hasn't had distinguishing characteristics. For a long time it was white and Protestant and Anglo-Saxon. I mean, it was, and other people who came here, other groups who came here, had to deal with that. And gradually, they became absorbed, and that it changed. And that is the quality of American identity, is that it is extremely absorptive. But the change is slow, and it often is full of conflict, and it doesn't always happen that easily. But it would be hard to say what there are certain values and principles and so forth that it stands for, but ethnically it is very mixed. But when you talk about becoming German, I mean, I think that's a difference. And I think when we compare those two things, even though I'm not saying German identity has remained stable and the same over centuries. It hasn't. It's changed too, but it's changed much more slowly because for a long time, it did have this jus sanguinis principle of citizenship. And so when you talk about people, you talk about people having rights to become citizens and rights to we want them to become German. And then this gentleman down here said, well, what does it mean to be German? In other words, is German going to stay, is it going to remain constant? Or is it going to change too as it absorbs more and more people? I mean, if you were to take a snapshot of Berlin today, it would look a lot different from Berlin in the 1950s or Berlin in the 1930s. It's much more heterogeneous, just looking at people's faces, and the color of their skin. I mean, it's much more mixed. So I think that's a question. I think that's partly what some of these. I think you were trying to get at is are people going to be accepted? We used to say this in the women's movement too. Do we want an equal share of the pie, or do we want the pie to change? Do we want the pie to look different with women in it? Is Germany going to look different if it has Turks in it as full citizens, or Palestinians, or whoever? So that I just wanted to ask you that question.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank you for your comment. It's connected with your comment, because you have mentioned that our reality in society is a multi-identity reality, and this is the case also in our country, of course, since decades. And the problem is how to deal with this ethnic diversity and multi-identity. I would like to pay your attention to the role of the state in this process. You are right. The role has not to be to create an identity, because the identity is a decision of any individual. This is a very important issue of democratic societies, in my opinion. But there must be rules, laws, and this laws has to decide under which conditions, for example, one person can get the German citizenship. This is a decision of law and a political decision. So, I have said this that this laws has to regard that every person who joined this citizenship has the same rights, and the affiliation to a religious group or a ethnic group does not play any role. It has no role, because in other words, we have no possibility to give every person equal rights. So we have to create a state with a state neutrality in this connection, in this connection with religion and ethnicity. So that means that also the Germanness, I understand it as a political right to get the citizenship, not in any ethnical dimension, because this is the danger also of the rising of new nationalism in Europe, not only in Germany, also in other countries. That the idea is to connect the political rights and the political nation to the ethnicity. This is the danger in the future, I think. And this concerns also the religion and the religion of Muslims, because I have told you on this field, on the religions and the Muslim, there is a strong influence from abroad. Why? The problem is we have no education of imams and religious teachers in Germany. This is a great discussed point, that we have to create such possibilities. For example, faculty at universities with chairs for theologians. This is a step. It will be the future in our country, also in other European countries, to avoid this influence from abroad, because is it the state-ruled Islam in Turkey? Is it the state-ruled Islam maybe in Saudi Arabia? These are state-controlled Islam scholars. And this is the influence, of course. In our country, and in the countries, in the other European Union countries. So this is a very important step, and the future will show if we can solve this problem, that we have our own theologians and German Muslims or Turkish-speaking Muslims, but that they learn the Islam education in German language, because these teachers and imams from Turkey, they don't speak German. They are preaching in Turkish language until now. And this is the problem, of course, to develop affiliation to our society, to the German society, I will say. So
I'm going to suggest the National Center for Urban Ethnic Studies, which actually is a creation of Monsignor Gino Baroni, who wanted to understand back in the 60s and 70s the role of ethnicity, but also the role of the church in some ethnic communities and the role that it would play. And it's fascinating because this issue of in the development of most of the ethnic, the Irish and the Italian, whatever, the importation of the clergy was an inhibitor. And it wasn't until this broad phenomena of the opening of the seminaries in America and the American clergy. And now, for example, I mean, the Maronites, I mean, you can know the difference and the success or failure of a church in the Maronite as to whether or not that the head of the church, the pastor, is an American born or is somebody from the old country. If he's from the old country, the kids stop going. And so to some degree what's going to happen and ought to happen, and to some degree you need to maybe let it free flow and not have the state intervene by creating these institutions of change, is to understand that as the kids are born in Germany and as they become German, and if they're allowed to feel that they're respected in the fullness of their ethnicity but with their new nationality, they will make the changes within the faith, and they won't accept an imam imported as an official spokesperson. They're not going to want that. Change is inevitable in these institutions, and so it's a problem with the recent immigrant, but it changes when you get into the first and second generation. That's an inevitability.
I'm a little bit less optimistic. I mean, I take the general point. I think the general point is onto something, but I guess count me as someone who's a little bit less optimistic about that narrative in kind of contemporary religious institutions. And if you wanted a proper name to capture my kind of worry about that narrative, the proper name would be Q-tape.
Al-Awlaki.
Anwar al-Awlaki, exactly. You couldn't find a more kind of American kind of sounding religious figure than al-Awlaki, and yet he's someone who finds himself in the predicament that he does. So I would just say that kind of that being conversant with a kind of idiomatic American style of preaching is not synonymous with sort of being on the right side of kind of Zogby's Whiggish history of how this all plays out.
But I don't think you can take that one example and explode it into a metaphor for the entire. But I will still stand on that notion from the experiences that we've had in several communities. That this change does come, and yeah, I knew when I said
Saw it a mile away.
Somebody was going to come up with that one. I don't think it undercuts the thesis. I think it's the exception to the rule.
But isn't it the case that mosques have become more like American? I mean, they've taken on a lot of the characteristics of American religious institutions. I mean, my sense is that mosques are in the Arab world are much more free floating, and the congregations are not as formalized, and they don't have as many social services and all that. I mean, I know there are social services organizations.
And they have soccer teams, and they have leagues, and they have
Here.
a whole they have a whole range of.
So they
institutions.
look like American religious institutions.
And the degree to which that has occurred, to that degree they've become successful. They've become the equivalent of what the old neighborhood Irish Catholic school was as the accelerator into the middle class. And as a result, values have changed.
Okay, last question, and then we're going to sort of have a general free-floating I don't know, sort of a continuation of this, but sort of where do we go from here?
My name is Samar Chatterjee from Safe Foundation. I want to say this, that there is not a good definition of integration into American. And I would like to say that even though I'm attending integration of Muslims, I'm not a Muslim. I'm originally from India, from the Hindu group. But I would say the integration in America, I've lived in America from 1969. And the way I have seen integration is you've got to be, I guess, to use the old terminology, an Uncle Tom in order to be part of the system. That's why you see some of the first generation like me who came, we don't get influential positions in government or in organization, but our children do get it. They are sent first for brainwashing to be a page at the Senate or the House where they get the so-called American brainwashing of what the foreign policy should be or how different international relations should be looked at. And then they are very quickly absorbed because they start talking the